Morning, church. I'm hoping everyone is doing well. I wanted to share with you guys a word of encouragement. It's one of my favorite passages. It's found in First Samuel chapter 30, verse 6. And it says, David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. And what's encouraging about that verse is the situation that David is in. David is running away, but not from a giant, not from some king, but from his own men. Now, there is a group called David's Mighty Men that he met at the cave of Adullam, and all of a sudden he's hearing gossip. He's out hearing a lot of chatter, a lot of whisper that these men, his own men, wanted to kill him. Now, what happened was that in First Samuel chapter 30, David and his men, they're out, and all of a sudden, these group called the Amalekites, they came in and they stole all their wives, stole all their plunder, just like pirates would do. And all of a sudden, David is so discouraged, and on top of that, he hears whisper, he hears gossip that his own men wanted to kill him. He's very discouraged. Now, the phrase "he strengthened himself in the Lord" is mentioned twice in First Samuel. The first is in chapter 23, but it's not from him, it's from Jonathan, his best friend. It says that Jonathan strengthened David in the Lord, his God. But the thing is this: Jonathan's dead, and David doesn't have Jonathan. So what is he going to do? And it says in verse 6, he strengthened himself in the Lord, his God. You see? Now, for the next four clips, I'm going to share with you guys four ways how you can encourage yourself in God. Now, the first is this: encourage yourself or strengthen yourself in God through remembering his silent sovereign hand. Okay. The reason why I say his silent sovereign hand is because of this. There's no mention of God's miraculous hand working in chapter 27, chapter 28, chapter 29, and chapter 30. A lot of times when we read the Bible, especially the biblical narratives, there's always, and it says, and the Lord moved in such a miraculous way. Moses and the nation of Israel, they were in front of the Red Sea, and the Lord departed the Red Sea. You'll hear mentioned like that. And it's clear that God is at work. It's a miraculous hand of God. But there's also other passages where God's name is not mentioned in that way. Sometimes God's name is not even mentioned at all. For example, the book of Esther. So the thing is this: do we conclude that God is not at work because his name is not mentioned in a miraculous way? No. The thing is this: we need to make a distinction between God's miraculous hand versus God's silent hand. And in First Samuel chapter 30, God's silent hand is at work. So God would work in a more subtle way. So, for example, after verse 6, where he says, David strengthened himself, the Lord his God. David and his mighty men, they're after these Amalekites, they're looking, and all of a sudden they run into some Egyptian. And this Egyptian was a slave of one of the Amalekites who was able to point them to the Amalekites, who from them they were able to get back their wives, they were able to get back their plunder. No one was hurt. Now, this is a very subtle way. Was this Egyptian from God? Absolutely. Is the miraculous hand of God at work? Does it say it's at work? Not necessarily. So the thing is this: through the Bible, we can make a distinction between the silent hand of God versus the miraculous hand of God. And a lot of times, the reason why I want to make this distinction and make it very clear to all of us is because a lot of the times there's this mindset that goes around the church that says the only way that God is at work in your life is if it's the miraculous hand of God. You see? And that's not true. See, I grew up with this mindset that, there had to be tongues and miracles and healings and all that stuff. And that's the only way that God's going to be at work. Remember this: God is also at work through his silent hand. You see? One time, I was in seminary, and I was always just living semester to semester, paying tuition off. And I had a friend of mine, a classmate of mine, who he had these crazy stories, story after story after story of the miraculous hand of God. Every single semester, he had no clue how he was going to pay for his tuition, but there would be some story of someone would all of a sudden give him a baby grand piano, and from that baby grand piano, he was able to sell it. And from that, he was able to pay his tuition. And I looked at his life, and I'll be like, man, that's crazy that God's at work in his life. And the mindset came in: maybe God's not at work in my life. You know, the reason why was because I'm looking at his life, and it was the miraculous hand of God at work in his life. But the thing is this: God's hand was also at work in my life, but it wasn't necessarily miraculous, but it was very subtle. It was very silent. You know how I paid for my tuition? Because my parents. You see, not the most crazy, miraculous story, but the thing is this: we were both able to pay for our tuition, but just through different means. One is more miraculous, one is more subtle, one is more silent. And the reason, again, I want to make this distinction is because A lot of times, as children of God, we can be very discouraged because all we see is the silent hand of God. And we don't see the miraculous hand of God because, again, we're people that we want to see the miraculous. And for us to think that God is at work, it needs to be the miraculous. Remember this, take courage that God is always at work in the lives of his people. But is it through the miraculous hand or is it through the silent hand? Remember this, do not be discouraged if you see the silent hand of God at work in your life. Remember, God is at work in your life. It might not be the miraculous, but it's through the silent. And you know what? Most of the times that God is at work in his people, his children's lives is through the silent sovereign hand of God. Be encouraged.